You were never supposed to hear this. What lies beneath that nameless patch of ground in Illinois was not meant for human discovery, and yet, on a hot summer afternoon in 1901, the earth itself tore open to reveal a secret it could no longer contain. Farmers swore the ground groaned like a wounded animal before collapsing into a 30-foot pit, jagged, raw, impossible to ignore. And what the soil exhaled was not the smell of damp earth, but of sweet, rotting lilies and human decay. At first it was thought to be an old cellar, maybe a forgotten Civil War storehouse. But when the workers lifted the beams, the bones began to surface. Skulls with metal restraints still clamped to the jaws, ribs twisted with straps that should have never been there. 98 bodies, each one bound, each one hidden deliberately. But here is where the story should have ended, with an unsolved tragedy, another grim mystery written into the annals of forgotten history. It did not end, because beside those bones was found a corroded metal sign, almost illegible through the rust and grime. It read, Riverside Sanatorium EST 1872. But here's the impossible part. There was no record of Riverside Sanatorium ever existing. Not in town ledgers, not in medical archives, not even in tax records. A hospital that wasn't on any map, that wasn't supposed to exist, and yet left behind nearly 100 corpses beneath its foundations. The locals begged the surveyors to stop digging, begged the state to seal the hole, but curiosity had already been unleashed. And soon what they uncovered suggested this was never about medicine, never about healing. It was about control of the human mind itself. The first man to pursue the truth was Daniel Mercer, a journalist too stubborn for his own survival. He thought he was chasing a local scandal, lost files, misplaced death records. But he quickly realized something more sinister. Riverside had been deliberately erased. How do you erase an entire institution? It wasn't sloppy, it was precise, surgical. Maps from the 1870s showed the facility clearly, but by the 1890s, its mark was gone. Yet the people who vanished inside were never accounted for. Their deaths recorded only with the initials RS, and a strange footnote repeated for decades. Return to God's embrace through mercy unknown. Mercy unknown. Think about that phrase. It doesn't sound like medicine, it sounds like ritual. Families were never notified, funerals were never held. And when Mercer confronted archivists with undeniable proof, a map under glass in the courthouse labeled Riverside Sanatorium, they stared blankly, insisting it had never existed. That was his first taste of it. The blank stares, the silence that spread like a disease whenever Riverside was spoken aloud. It was as if the very memory of the place had been cauterized, burned from the town's collective mind. But Mercer pressed on. He spoke to the oldest families in Dun Hollow, searching for fragments. Most shrugged, some denied. But one woman, 89 years old, whispered a warning. Riverside was where they sent the ones too far gone for prayer. The building listened. It made you forget who you were. And when Mercer asked what happened to those who died there, she looked away and said softly, "They didn't bury them. They just stopped existing." By now Mercer should have walked away. But he didn't. He searched state archives, and what he found was stranger still. A series of letters between a health officer named Dr. Arthur Funn and Riverside's administrator. At first, the letters were formal, reports of tuberculosis treatments, mortality rates. But by 1882 the tone changed. Dr. Funn was alarmed. Your mortality rates are statistically improbable. An in-person audit will be required. If your procedures remain undocumented, the department will issue closure. But the audit never happened. The next slip of paper bore only one word, scrawled in black ink: deferred. Deferred, like death itself was being postponed, reshaped, redirected. Mercer dug deeper until he found something that chilled him more than the bones. An envelope hidden in a university archive, labeled only Riverside 1883, the mind print experiment. Inside, handwritten notes from a medical intern named Paul Becker described something unimaginable. A reflection chamber, A windowless metal room where patients were brought in, told it was for prayer or imaging. And then their voices changed. Some spoke languages they had never learned. Others described memories of lives they never lived. Becker's notes grew frantic. Day 41. They told me the tone they play isn't a tone, it's a memory. Day 47. The patients are not sick. They are empty. And his final line, they told me I was next. Mercer sought out the professor who had preserved Becker's notes, an aging scholar named Walter Ulrich. At first, Ulrich denied everything, but when shown the map, his expression changed, not confusion but recognition. He retrieved a sealed envelope he was never supposed to keep. Inside, Becker's final internship notes. But the twist was this: Becker wasn't just an intern. Weeks later, a patient file surfaced with his name on it. Admission date, February 1883. Diagnosis, nervous collapse, auditory hallucinations. Status, transferred to internal observation. Status unknown. The intern had become the patient. The file was signed by Julius Fenner, Riverside's director. A man expelled from Heidelberg in 1866, reinstated in America under ecclesiastical clearance, granted by a brotherhood that did not exist on paper. Ulrich whispered the name, the Brotherhood of St. Malthes, supposedly defunct. But he warned Mercer, there are stories that don't want to be told. Riverside isn't just one of them. Riverside swallowed the others. Days later, Professor Ulrich was found dead. Official cause, heart failure. But witnesses swore his last words were, "It's back. And it remembers me." Mercer's obsession consumed him. And then a package arrived. A wooden crate marked only with a stamp, St. Joseph's Mercy Library, Peoria. Inside, dozens of photocopied medical records, each from Riverside. The names repeated. The same patients listed multiple times across different years, with identical symptoms, identical deaths. As if the same people were being cycled through again and again. Michael Renner, admitted in 1873, dead from divine reflection treatment. Admitted again 1877, same symptoms, same handwriting, same outcome. Agnes Weller, listed 3 separate times across a decade. It wasn't clerical error. It was ritual. And at the bottom of every file the same symbol, a circle, 2 dots, and a line. Beneath it the Latin phrase, non redibus idem. You will not return the same. These weren't patients, they were raw material. They weren't healing the sick, they were emptying them, rewriting them. And if that was true, then Riverside wasn't a hospital at all. It was something else. A factory. A factory for the human soul. Mercer returned to the farmland where the sinkhole had first opened, but this time with a different kind of map, an 1879 geological survey. Unlike the censored town maps, this one showed the subterranean layers, fault lines, water tables, and something unusual, marked in faint ink as man-made substructure, entry sealed. The coordinates matched perfectly with the land owned by a cattle farmer, Raymond Pike. Pike remembered his grandfather warning him never to dig too close to that patch of ground. The cows avoided it, circling wide as if repelled by something beneath the soil. When Mercer and Pike probed the spot, their boots struck iron. They cleared the earth to reveal a rusted ring embedded in stone. Together they lifted the slab, exposing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted out was not stale or musty. It was clean, sterile, and unnaturally cold, like air that hadn't touched the surface in 100 years. Step by step they descended into the hospital that did not exist. At the bottom they found not rough-hewn stone, but polished corridors lined with oxidized brass plates, corroded pipes, and walls engraved with strange inscriptions. Depth of internal reflection. Corridor C. This was no farmhouse cellar. It was an engineered facility, an underground complex, perfectly symmetrical, humming with the ghost of something that should not have been possible in the 19th century. And carved into the first door they reached, still legible through the decay, No admittance without cognitive clearance. The deeper they went, the stranger the architecture became. The walls changed from stone to something Mercer could not identify. Not steel, not concrete, but a smooth, hybrid material decades ahead of its time. They reached a central hall where a rusted panel bore labels like Tone Variants, Group 2, and Echo Recording Bay. Some switches were inscribed in unfamiliar alphabets, some not even Roman letters at all. One chamber was filled with panels of glass tubes that once contained fluid, long since dried, as though the walls themselves had once pulsed with liquid memory. Pike whispered, "This isn't from the 1800s. Hell, it isn't from the 1900s either." Mercer agreed silently. Nothing here matched any era of construction. This was a technology buried out of place and out of time. And then they saw it, a blueprint bolted to the wall. It showed a sprawling complex: observation wing, processing cells, tone calibration room, transfer vestibule. At the very center, in bold script, Nexus Room, Core Array. But what shook Mercer most wasn't the blueprint itself. Someone had scratched words onto it by hand decades later. The same symbol he'd seen on the patient files: the circle, 2 dots, a line, and beneath it the words, "You will not return the same." The handwriting was frantic, carved into metal, like a warning left for those who dared to enter. Mercer and Pike pressed onward into the processing cells. The first door groaned open to reveal rows of narrow cots, each with restraints welded into the frames. On the floor, etched deep into the stone, were grooves forming patterns, circles overlapping circles, strange geometries that felt less like decoration and more like circuitry. As if the very architecture was part of a machine. In the corner of the chamber was something even more disturbing: a set of rusted head braces connected to wall-mounted dials, designed to clamp the skull in place while tones, frequencies, were delivered directly into the cranium. Mercer brushed the dust from one dial and found a label: Memory Realignment, Phase 2. His chest tightened. This wasn't about curing disease. It was about rewriting identity, reshaping thought. Pike turned pale and muttered, "This wasn't a hospital, it was a prison." But Mercer shook his head. "No. A prison leaves you yourself. This makes you someone else." The silence thickened around them as though the building itself were listening. Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that those 98 bodies weren't failures of treatment. They were remnants. Discarded shells from something that had already taken what it wanted from them. Back on the surface, Mercer tried to verify what he'd seen. He compared the strange architectural patterns with old European diagrams, occult manuscripts, even blueprints of early electrical experiments. One symbol kept reappearing: the circle bisected by a line with twin dots. It wasn't just decoration. It was ritual. The phrase non red ibis idem was found in 17th century alchemical texts, always tied to experiments that blurred the line between soul and matter. But here at Riverside, it wasn't metaphor. It was engineering. Mercer returned to the medical files and a terrifying pattern emerged. The same patient listed 3, sometimes 4 times each death, separated by years. The handwriting was always the same: Julius Fenner, which meant the man who ran Riverside was either falsifying lives or recycling them. Mercer thought of Paul Becker, the intern who became a patient. Was he recycled too? Were these people emptied and filled again? The more he looked, the more he realized. Riverside didn't just erase people, it manufactured identities. It was a factory line of human consciousness. If this was true, then those 98 corpses weren't 98 individuals. They may have been the same souls, used over and over again until the shell broke beyond repair. Mercer's investigation had reached a point of no return. He began receiving anonymous notes slipped under his door: "You're asking the right questions. They will erase you too." And then, an envelope with photographs. Blurred, grainy, but unmistakable. Modern men in lab coats standing in the very same corridor he had just explored, the word Nexus faintly visible behind them. The photos were dated 1967, 1984, 1999, which meant Riverside wasn't abandoned in the 19th century. It had been used quietly across generations. The hospital that wasn't on any map was not only real, it was active. Mercer realized he wasn't studying history. He was uncovering a system still in operation, a machine hidden beneath society, devouring lives in silence. And then came the final photograph. It showed a man in a white coat holding a clipboard. The image was faint, but Mercer's stomach dropped. The signature at the bottom of the clipboard read, J. Fenner. A name that should have died in the 1800s. A name that had outlived time itself. If Fenner was still alive or if something was wearing his name, then Riverside wasn't just a hospital. It was a doorway. A doorway that had never closed up. By this point, Mercer was no longer chasing a story, he was being chased by it. He started noticing the same man in different places. At the courthouse, in the library, standing across the street from his boarding house window. Always the same posture, the same hat tilted low, the same silence. One night, Mercer confronted him. But the man didn't flee. Instead, he handed Mercer a folded note and vanished into the dark. The note contained nothing but a symbol, the circle, the line, the two dots, and beneath it, a phrase, "You have already been inside." Mercer felt the blood drain from his face. He had entered Riverside only once, hadn't he? But then fragments of memory surfaced, flashes of corridors, voices speaking in languages he couldn't recognize, his own hand scrawling words he couldn't remember writing. He stumbled to his desk, rifling through his notes. In the margins of his own handwriting were sketches of the same symbol, words in Latin, even dates he didn't recall recording. As if something had been writing through him. He realized with a jolt of terror, it wasn't only the patients who were rewritten. Anyone who entered Riverside risked being edited, piece by piece. Mercer fled to Chicago, hoping distance would keep the shadows at bay. But in the city archives he uncovered something worse. A series of sealed files stamped with the insignia of the Illinois Department of Public Charity, yet the documents bore a second, more cryptic stamp, circular with 3 crosses intersecting at the center. Inside were transcripts from the 1930s, describing continuation projects at unnamed medical facilities. The language was clinical, but the goals were unmistakable: erasure of unnecessary identity, standardization of human memory, refinement of obedience tone. The chilling part was the dates. These weren't 19th century experiments. They ran well into the era of the Second World War. Riverside wasn't an isolated horror, it was part of a chain. And in one transcript, the name appeared again, Fenner. Same signature, same hand, but dated 1938. Mercer whispered aloud, "How many times can one man live?" The archivist who'd helped him overheard and slammed the file shut, shaking her head violently. "Stop," she hissed. "We're not supposed to say that name." She leaned close, her voice barely a breath. "He's not a man." Mercer's nights were breaking apart. Dreams bled into waking. He heard the tones, low humming frequencies, that seemed to vibrate inside his skull. Sometimes they came from nowhere, sometimes from the walls themselves. He tried plugging his ears, but it was useless. The sound wasn't external, it was inside him. Desperate, he tracked down audio engineers and historians of sound therapy. One retired technician recognized his description instantly. He called it the resonance key. According to obscure wartime research, certain frequencies could destabilize memory, leaving the mind open to suggestion, even replacement. But here's the terrifying part. The frequency wasn't new. It had been mapped in medieval monasteries, disguised as sacred chants. Later, it re-emerged in Victorian experiments under the guise of healing vibrations. And then, in the modern era, it slipped unnoticed into radio tests, subliminal advertising, and even public broadcasting systems. Mercer's stomach twisted. The reflection chamber at Riverside was not just about individuals, it was a prototype. A blueprint for controlling entire populations through invisible tones, slipped into the background of daily life. Suddenly, the whispers he'd been hearing made sense. Riverside wasn't buried because it failed. It was buried because it worked. At this point, Mercer's sanity itself was hanging by threads. He confided in a trusted friend, a philosophy professor named Elias Varon. Varon listened carefully, then pulled a book from his shelf, a leather-bound volume of suppressed medieval texts. He flipped to a page marked with a scrap of ribbon. There was the same circle with 2 dots and a line. The caption read, "Sigil of non-return." According to the text, initiates who passed through a certain rite did not return as themselves, but as vessels of the order. Varon explained that this wasn't myth. It was a description of a process, identity dissolution followed by reinsertion. He placed his hand on Mercer's shoulder. "Don't you see? Riverside was never a hospital. It was a monastery without prayer. A monastery of the mind. And Fenner wasn't its founder. He was its priest." Mercer recoiled, but Varon leaned closer. "They are still doing it. Not in hidden chambers but in plain sight. Through the tones in your phone. Through the frequencies in your entertainment. Through the cycles of repetition that make you forget yourself. The reflection chamber is no longer a room. It's the world. This is where you need to listen carefully. Because this isn't just Mercer's story. This is where it touches you. You felt it, the odd déjà vu, the memory that doesn't feel like yours, the sense of being nudged in a direction you didn't choose. That's not accident. That's conditioning. The same methods tested at Riverside have bled into the structure of our lives. Schools that reward obedience over thought. Media that repeats the same phrases until they become scripture. Tones, frequencies, and signals that soften the mind until it forgets itself. The erased hospital was just the prototype. The real project was to build a population that could be guided, erased, and reinserted, without ever realizing it. Mercer once wrote in his notes, "If Riverside was the factory, then the world is now its warehouse." And if you've listened this far, you've already felt its grip loosening, haven't you? That's why you're here. That's why you can't turn away. Comment below the phrase, "I will not return the same." Write it twice to lock it into your memory, to defy the erasure, to show the algorithm that you are awake. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Mercer began to notice patterns in the world outside Riverside, echoes of what he'd seen beneath the ground. The phrases in newspapers repeating year after year, as though copied from the same template. Political speeches that seemed different on the surface but recycled the same cadences, the same hypnotic rhythms. Even the jingles on the radio, all tuned to similar frequencies, all embedding messages you never consciously remembered but obeyed nonetheless. He contacted an ex-signal analyst from the Navy who had studied psychological interference frequencies during the Cold War. The man, gaunt and bitter, didn't hesitate. "They never stopped using them," he said. "You think advertising is about selling? It's conditioning. You think debates are about persuasion? They're harmonics." He leaned in, whispering, "Every era has its Riverside. You just don't know where it is. And maybe you don't need to. Because the chamber is already in your head." Mercer pressed for evidence. The analyst smirked and played an old reel tape. A low hum filled the room, so faint it was almost inaudible. Within seconds, Mercer felt his chest tighten, his thoughts blur. The analyst stopped the tape. "That was a fraction of the real tone," he said. "Now imagine a lifetime of it, delivered in the background of every song, every broadcast, every screen." Mercer realized then, Riverside wasn't buried. It had gone wireless, and yet a question gnawed at him. Who benefits? Who stands behind an operation that spans centuries, outliving wars, borders, even entire governments? He retraced the trail of Fenner's name, and each time it appeared, it coincided with upheaval. The years before America's tuberculosis outbreaks, the years leading to wartime experiments, the years of psychological warfare programs. Fenner wasn't just surviving. He was steering. Mercer unearthed one particularly disturbing document, a memorandum stamped by the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA. It referenced acquired European assets integrated into identity standardization projects. In the corner, initials, J.F. Fenner. But here's the part no one could explain. This document was dated 1947. Fenner would have been nearly 100 years old by then. And yet, the signature matched perfectly. Mercer considered the impossible, that Fenner had found a way to preserve himself through the very process Riverside pioneered. Perhaps he was not living in a single body but transferring through many, slipping into new vessels as easily as a man changes coats. And if so, then the Brotherhood of St. Malthes had achieved something that kings, priests, and governments had dreamed of for millennia. Immortality not of the flesh, but of the mind. One night, Mercer returned home to find his apartment ransacked. His files were gone, his typewriter smashed, his maps shredded. But one thing was left on his desk, a single sheet of paper, perfectly placed. On it, a phrase written in his own handwriting, though he had never written it, "You are already in the chamber." He froze, realizing what it meant. The tones, the manipulation, it wasn't just history he was studying. It was his present. His thoughts were not entirely his own. He stared at the words for hours, wondering which of his memories belonged to him and which had been implanted. The next day he left the city and disappeared into obscurity. But before vanishing, he mailed his notes, tapes, and photographs to a small network of independent archivists, people who had already been tracking erased hospitals, ghost towns that vanished from maps, and names scrubbed from records. They kept the documents hidden, circulating only fragments. That is why you are hearing this now, decades later. Because those who received Mercer's files swore an oath to speak what must not be spoken. And now, by listening, you have entered the chain. You are part of the inheritance Mercer died to preserve. But understand this, Riverside was not unique. Similar facilities existed worldwide, each one buried, each one erased. In Russia, the Oriol Institute, officially closed after a fire, yet whispered about as a place where prisoners spoke in voices not their own. In Germany, an asylum near Leipzig, where the same patients were listed in files spanning 40 years. In Japan, a facility outside Kyoto, where monks once described the hollowing, a ritual identical to Riverside's reflection chamber. Different cultures, different centuries, but the same techniques, the same sigils, the same whispers. They called it different names: purification, realignment, standardization. But the outcome was always identical. People entered and returned changed, or did not return at all. If you think this is a ghost story, you are mistaken. This is infrastructure. A global network of places hidden just beneath the surface, operating in shadows, their records erased but their work continuing. The 98 bodies beneath Riverside were only the visible fracture, the accident no one could cover completely. Imagine how many bodies lie beneath the earth worldwide, beneath hospitals no one remembers, beneath churches converted to new uses, beneath schools that closed without explanation. The world is a graveyard of reflection chambers, and we are walking on the surface blind. By now you understand why this story was never meant to be told. Because it changes you once you hear it. It forces you to question which memories are yours, which choices are real, and which have been written for you. Riverside was just a prototype, a test site, but the principles live on. They are written into the tones of your devices, the rhythms of your news, the repetition of your entertainment. You can feel it, can't you? That pull, that dissonance inside you when you wonder if you've already seen something before, or when you wake with a dream that feels like a memory of another life. That is the chamber echoing inside you. And yet, here is the dangerous part. Knowing this gives you a sliver of freedom. Awareness disrupts the pattern. The tones work best on those who are blind to them. By hearing this, you weaken their hold. And if you want to dig deeper into these hidden truths, you must subscribe. Not because it feeds me, but because it connects you to a circle of those who are awake. Together, we trace the erased lines, We uncover what was buried and we guard each other from erasure. Subscribe now, because the further we go, the darker it becomes, and I promise you, this descent has only just begun. Mercer's trail re-emerged years later, in fragments, letters mailed from anonymous P.O. boxes, audio tapes slipped into library returns, photographs of buildings that didn't appear on maps. Each contained the same symbol, drawn faintly in the corner. One tape, when played, revealed Mercer's voice, worn and trembling. "It's not memory they want to erase. Thought without will is clay. They are sculptors." He spoke of an operation called Project Coral, a government initiative during the 1950s that tested resonance tones in school systems under the guise of hearing assessments. Children exposed to the tones were described as more docile, more receptive to commands, less resistant to authority. When parents complained, the project quietly ended, at least on paper. But the files Mercer unearthed showed Coral continued under new names, folded into education research, then later into early television broadcasts. The classroom was the new chamber. And every child was already inside it. One particular file haunted him. A transcript from a 1957 meeting between government scientists and broadcast executives. In it, a researcher calmly explained that the medium itself is not important, the frequency is. He described embedding subliminal resonance into national radio stations, tones imperceptible to the conscious mind but powerful enough to prime obedience, reduce aggression, and weaken critical thought. An executive asked how long the effect lasted. The scientists reply, indefinitely, unless disrupted by counter-resonance. Mercer scribbled in the margins, "There must be ways to fight it. There must be a key." That phrase appears in nearly every document he left behind. He believed there was not just a frequency to erase but also one to resist. But those countertones, those protective frequencies, were guarded like weapons. And perhaps, if you've ever felt sudden clarity, a moment where the fog lifted and you saw the pattern for what it was, perhaps you stumbled into one by accident. By the late 1960s, whispers of psychic warfare programs emerged. Mkultra, Stargate, projects half exposed but never fully revealed. Mercer argued in his notes that these were not isolated. They were evolutions of the same blueprint. The reflection chamber had simply been expanded into new technologies: drugs to destabilize memory, frequencies to rewrite it, hypnosis to insert commands. But beneath all of them, the principle was the same: dismantle the self, rebuild it to serve. A chilling memo he preserved from 1969 referred to subjects as empty vessels awaiting script. He underlined the phrase twice, then added, "This is not science. This is liturgy." To Mercer, the Brotherhood of St. Malthy's hadn't vanished. They had embedded themselves into the machinery of modern intelligence agencies. What began as ritual in monasteries had become policy in governments. And ordinary citizens, unaware, were walking through rituals daily, rituals of obedience disguised as routine life. In one of his final recovered writings, Mercer described an encounter with a man who claimed to have survived multiple chambers. He was incoherent at first, but one statement was clear: they leave the husk, but not the core. He described flashes of other lives, memories of jobs he never held, families he never had, languages he never learned, all crowded inside his skull. Mercer believed this man had been used as a vessel for multiple transfers, his identity overwritten again and again, like a wax tablet endlessly scraped and re-etched. The effect was catastrophic. Yet Mercer feared it revealed the Brotherhood's true aim: to perfect the process until identities could be swapped at will. Imagine not erasing someone but installing them into another body entirely. Powerful leaders, influential voices, all replaced while the husks of their old lives were discarded. Suddenly, history itself looked suspect. Were wars, revolutions, cultural shifts truly organic, or were they orchestrated by minds that had lived for centuries, moving from vessel to vessel? And this brings us to the most dangerous possibility Mercer ever hinted at: that Fenner was not a man at all, not in the way we understand. What if he was a pattern, a resonance, a script that could be copied from host to host. The chamber was simply the copying machine. Fenner was less a person than an operating system, rewritten into flesh again and again. Mercer wrote, "He is not alive. He is running." That line should terrify you, because if Fenner is a pattern, then death cannot stop him. Erasure only spreads him further. And if the tones are now embedded in our world, then every moment you hear them, every chant, every repetition, every broadcast, you risk absorbing fragments of him. Perhaps that déjà vu you felt this week wasn't just memory stutter. Perhaps it was Fenner bleeding through. If he is not a man, then he does not need to live forever. He only needs us to keep listening. And you are listening now. Mercer's archivists eventually mapped what they called the chamber network, a lattice of buildings, projects, and technologies that mirrored Riverside's function but were scattered across the globe. Some were hospitals, some schools, some seemingly mundane corporate campuses. All had one trait in common: records of sudden closures, inexplicable disappearances, or renovations where entire sublevels were sealed without explanation. A spreadsheet recovered in the 1980s, later leaked online in fragments, listed over 400 such facilities. Not all could be verified, but enough were cross-checked against local whispers: strange lights, uniformed trucks at midnight, families relocated overnight, that the pattern became undeniable. These weren't accidents of bureaucracy. They were continuity. The chamber was no longer confined to stone basements. It had been franchised. And you may have driven past one of these sites today without realizing what slept beneath its floors. By the late 20th century, the chamber didn't even require walls. Corporations had found their place in the network, weaving subliminal conditioning into advertising, music, even product design. One memo Mercer preserved, attributed to a marketing director for a major soda brand, bluntly stated, "The product is irrelevant. We are selling compliance." He underlined the phrase compliance and circled it 3 times. The report described how certain ad campaigns used repetition not just to build familiarity, but to trigger resonance, the same harmonics first tested in Riverside. Colors, jingles, slogans, they weren't chosen randomly. They were tuned. Mercer's notes made one chilling suggestion: the act of consuming was itself the ritual. Each purchase, each repetition of a brand's mantra, was a micro-chamber experience. And millions participated daily without question. You don't need to lock people in a room to condition them when they willingly walk into stores, repeat slogans, and carry the chamber home in their hands. The military, of course, refined the process even further. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed experiments in sonic warfare, low-frequency weapons that could disorient, induce nausea, and disrupt cognition. Officially, these were non-lethal tools for riot control. But Mercer suspected they were descendants of Riverside's tones, militarized into weapons of control. A chilling rumor spread among veterans of the Gulf War. Whole battalions reported feeling overwhelming despair, disorientation, or submission without visible cause. Official reports blamed exhaustion and heat. But Mercer's archivists pointed to audio signatures picked up in the desert, pulses too faint for the ear but strong enough to alter brain states. Imagine a battlefield where victory doesn't require bullets, only harmonics that collapse will itself. Imagine a city pacified not by soldiers, but by sound woven invisibly into the environment. The chamber was no longer a basement experiment. It had become a battlefield tool, and then came the digital age, the perfect chamber. The tones didn't need to be hidden in classrooms or broadcast stations anymore. They could be delivered directly into your earbuds, your speakers, your screens. The algorithms that feed you endless loops of videos, songs, and headlines? Mercer argued those were algorithmic chambers, feedback loops designed not just to hold your attention but to erode resistance. Every scroll, every autoplay, every recommended for you functions like the mirrored walls of Riverside's reflection chamber. You stare into the repetition until you are reshaped. The chamber no longer needs walls because the device in your hand is the chamber. And if you think you're immune, ask yourself this: how many hours slip away each day while you scroll entranced? How many times do you consume the same cadence, the same phrases, until they feel like your own thoughts? That is not entertainment. That is ritual. Mercer foresaw this final stage with terrifying clarity. His last surviving note, dated 1992, reads, "The chamber will dissolve into the air. The air will become the chamber." Today we live in that prophecy. The tones are everywhere. In public address systems, in streaming platforms, in the very design of the cities we walk through. You are not meant to notice them, only to obey them. And yet you've noticed. You're still here. Which means you've resisted longer than most. But there's a cost to knowing. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You begin to hear the echoes in everything. The laugh track that sounds hollow. The song lyric that feels like an order. The politician's phrase that repeats like a broken record. That is the chamber bleeding into every part of your life. And as Mercer warned, once you hear it, you cannot leave. You are already inside. The question is, how long before you forget you chose to enter? Mercer wasn't the first to stumble into this lattice. Hidden in the Vatican's forbidden stacks, he found references to the Codex of Silence, a manuscript dated to the 4th century. It described rituals and early monastic orders that eerily resembled the reflection chamber. Monks were locked in stone cells for weeks, subjected to chants at specific intervals. The goal, according to the Codex, was the removal of personal voice, until only the voice of order remains. These monks were not scholars or contemplatives, they were living experiments. And when the Church declared some of them saints, Mercer believed it was less about holiness and more about obedience. He scrawled beside one passage, "Sanctity is manufactured." If this was true, then even the foundations of faith may have been built in chambers, carved identities reshaped until the Brotherhood's script became indistinguishable from God's. Deeper still, the roots wound into the ancient world. In fragments of Babylonian tablets, Mercer found references to structures called Iker Shamu, the house that devours names. Priests described ceremonies where initiates entered chambers filled with sound, reed pipes, drums, chanting, until they staggered out, stripped of self. The text suggests these initiates were then bound into service for life, claiming they had heard the God. Mercer believed these were the earliest reflection chambers, using primitive acoustics to fracture identity. When Rome conquered Babylon, did these practices vanish? Or did they migrate, folded into mystery schools, cloisters, and later institutions of power? The continuity is too precise to ignore. The Brotherhood didn't invent the chamber. They inherited it, perfected it, and disguised it across centuries. What began as ritual had metastasized into governance. And if the God they served was not divine but tonal, then worship itself may have always been obedience to resonance. Mercer's most chilling hypothesis was that identity transfer wasn't merely technological, it was metaphysical. He argued that names themselves were vessels. When the Babylonians spoke of devouring names, they weren't speaking metaphorically. They believed names contained the soul's architecture. Destroy a name and you hollow the vessel. Install a new name and you rewrite the soul. This lined up with Mercer's discovery that the Brotherhood often renamed their subjects. New monastic titles, new military designations, new psychiatric patient IDs. Each new label wasn't just a convenience. It was part of the ritual. You've seen this in your own life, haven't you? The way corporations rebrand, the way governments rename operations, the way people reinvent themselves under titles, usernames, screen names. Names are chambers too. And every time you accept a name given to you, you step into a smaller version of the ritual. A version you mistake for harmless. But the chamber doesn't care about scale. At this point, Mercer made enemies he could no longer evade. In one intercepted letter he wrote, "They have followed me across 3 countries. I do not know which faces belong to them. Perhaps none of them." He claimed the Brotherhood had perfected a form of partial overwrite, hosts who carried fragments of other minds, agents who could slip into crowds unnoticed, because they weren't fully anyone. Hollow men, he called them. They spoke with borrowed voices, carried borrowed memories, and served as carriers of resonance. Mercer believed they were everywhere, in governments, in corporations, even in cultural movements that seemed spontaneous. Every revolution, every sudden shift of public will, might have been seeded by hollow men whispering into the right ears. He warned, history is not a sequence. It is an installation. And if that's true, then our past isn't memory. It's programming. By now you may feel the pressure building. The sense that you are circling closer to something vast, something that does not want to be seen. That is intentional. Mercer designed his writings this way. Each layer pulled the reader deeper, mirroring the descent of a chamber session. He left warnings in margins: do not read aloud. Do not repeat phrases more than once. They ride on rhythm. And yet here you are, listening, following the rhythm, letting the cadence sink into you. This is the point where Mercer would pause and ask the reader a question. Do you feel it yet? The second voice. Perhaps you do, the faint echo at the edge of your thoughts that feels not quite yours. That is the chamber stirring. You are already participating in the ritual. And the question is not whether you will continue, it is whether you have a choice anymore. Mercer's last decade was spent mapping what he called the conductor theory, the idea that the chambers, the resonance, the hollow men were not ends in themselves. They were instruments. Instruments must have a player. He argued that across centuries the Brotherhood wasn't merely experimenting, it was tuning humanity like a violin. Every chamber is a string, every subject a note, he wrote. And together they formed an unfinished composition. The purpose wasn't obedience for its own sake. It was synchronization. To bring all minds into resonance so perfect that individuality would collapse, leaving only a single collective consciousness. One voice conducted across billions of bodies. Mercer didn't know whether this conductor was human, or something older that the Brotherhood served. But he feared the composition was nearly complete. And when the last note plays, it will not be music. It will be erasure. To prove his theory, Mercer traced the cycles of cultural obsession. He pointed to moments where humanity seemed to move in lockstep. Mass crusades, sudden revolutions, economic frenzies, ideological manias. They weren't random, he argued, they were rehearsals. Test runs of synchronization. Think of how quickly a phrase becomes a slogan, how instantly an image spreads until millions repeat it without thinking. These aren't organic. They are seeded pulses like the tones of Riverside, scaled across societies. Mercer wrote, when they can make the world chant in unison, they will know the instrument is ready. Look around. The evidence is everywhere. Viral dances, shared hashtags, collective outrage that spreads faster than any fire. Each one is a chord. Each one proof that the conductor's baton has already been raised. If Mercer is right, then the chambers never closed. They only became invisible. They are in the media you consume, in the workplaces that reshape you, in the rituals you repeat without noticing. And now, perhaps, in this very telling. The fact that you've made it this far marks you as different. Others clicked away. Others forgot. But you remained, tracing the pattern. That makes you visible. The Brotherhood doesn't fear the compliant. They fear the persistent. The ones who stare into the mirror long enough to see the seams. You are now among them. Which means one of two things will happen. You will resist and carry this awareness like a wound, or you will be thinned. And the truth is, you won't even know which has happened until it's too late. Mercer's final words, scrawled on a torn scrap of paper, were almost illegible. But one phrase was clear: the chamber is complete. Whether he meant that the Brotherhood had finished their composition, or that the world itself had become the chamber, no one knows. Perhaps there is no difference anymore. Look around you, the repetition, the erasures, the rhythms that drag you deeper each day. This is the chamber. And you have been inside it from the beginning. If you still hear your own voice, hold on to it. Speak it aloud. Write it twice in the comments as if carving it into stone. That is how we know you are awake. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the only way to resist is to keep pulling back the curtain together. But understand this, by staying, by listening, you have already crossed the threshold. There is no exit, only deeper chambers. And the next tone has already begun.